A lot of beginners hear tools, resources, and prompts and assume they are three names for roughly the same thing. That confusion is normal, but it leads to messy server design and bad capability boundaries. The fastest way to separate them is one sentence. Tools do actions. Resources provide context. Prompts guide workflows. That one rule will prevent a lot of bad architecture decisions. Once you think in intent, the system gets easier to design. You stop building one giant capability blob and start choosing the right primitive for the job. If the model needs to do something in a real system, you are in tool territory. Query a database, create a ticket, restart a deployment, send a message. That is action. So the primitive should be a tool. Good tool, design stays narrow. Search.docs, get pod logs, create issue, restart deployment with approval. Each one expresses one useful action with a clear boundary and reviewable intent. The mistake is to use a tool for everything. One giant action surface like get everything or admin. Everything usually hides intent, grows blast radius, and makes the system harder to trust. If the model needs to read something before it can answer, you are in resource territory. A file, a schema, a deployment manifest, or a document is context, so the primitive should be a resource. Good resources are readable, scoped, and intentional. File, project, readme.md, Postgres, schema, public. K8's, namespace, default, deployment, API. Each one gives context without pretending to be an action. The mistake is to treat resources like a giant data dump. Sending the whole code base or every customer record is not context design. It is noise and risk disguised as convenience. If the task repeats and needs the same reasoning frame every time, you are in prompt territory. Review a PR, summarize an incident, generate release notes. That is workflow guidance, so the primitive should be a prompt. Good prompts give the model a repeatable frame. They define the task, the arguments, and the output shape. That is why the same workflow becomes easier to teach, reuse, and evaluate. Here is the important part. Real systems often use all three together. A user asks why an app is failing. The model reads the deployment YAML as a resource, pulls pod logs with a tool, and follows an incident analysis prompt to structure the answer. So the decision tree is simple. Need to read, use a resource. Need to act, use a tool. Need a repeatable workflow, use a prompt. That one decision tree will clean up a lot of beginner architecture. When you design this way, your server surfaces become smaller, safer, and easier to reason about. That is the real benefit. Better separation means better governance and better systems. And now that the roles are clear, the next step is practical building. When you create your first MCP server, start by deciding which resources, which tools, and which prompts actually deserve to exist.